for the kind introduction. So it's true that I studied from theology. My dissertation dealt with early 20th century ecological theology, partly done in Helsinki and partly in Chicago. And I've actually met here people who have been reading it, which is always a pleasure. But for the last 10 years, I've been focusing on emotional dimensions of the environmental crisis. The approach could be described generally as psychosocial, meaning trying to take an interdisciplinary look on both psychological factors and social factors, but underneath that are, of course, meaning systems or worldviews, religion, and so on. So my expertise is really sort of generalist expertise, and the kind of introduction by Fraser is right to a certain extent, but usually I'm part of the research teams which plan the empirical studies, and then people who are more skilled in the actual statistical analysis and those kinds of things do them sort of on the ground empirical work. And today I'll speak about many environmental emotions, something about attitudes and also interconnections with science and religion. There's a lot to talk and discuss about, and I very much look forward to interacting with you. This is a climate emotions wheel, a visualization of certain emotions which have been observed that people feel in relation to climate change issues. Has somebody seen this before, the wheel visualization? Well, we've been in touch with Tim already before. So this was published originally in 2023. I was part of the working group, and they used one of my articles heavily in making it, namely this toward a taxonomy of climate emotions or open access available. And in psychology, there's a long history of using visualizations of emotions. The emotion wheel by Robert Plutchik is perhaps the most famous one. It also tries to build a sort of axial structure of emotion and kind of counter emotion, which works to a certain extent, and then you get into trouble because reality is so difficult to fit into nice models, and that's a thing much present in my work, and you'll see several of those model attempts also today. So there is 4 sort of segments, and this is not to be taken as total categorization of emotions. And emotion science has a long history, and there are a wide variety of different views and also different concepts. So there's no general agreement about emotion dynamics. Now, this is a very blunt statement, but there's lots of disagreement about what emotions actually are, what terms should be used. So there's a great contradiction between sort of lay understandings that, of course, we know what emotion is. But then if you go into more exact analysis about what's the difference between emotion and feeling, for example, in the Anglo-American sphere, or affect, which is a research tradition growingly used. So it easily gets very complicated, and I tried not to go very far into that here because we could easily spend the whole 45 minutes talking about those nuances. But if you are interested, for example, Scarantino has written insightfully about this, both in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is freely available online, and also in this very heavy Handbook of Emotion Research, which is sort of dominated by constructivist approaches, but it has a variety, and there's an opening chapter on philosophy of emotions. So I was able to have some influence on this, but the end result is by a working group. I wouldn't have put guilt and shame under sadness. I tried to propose that perhaps a 5th color would be nice, but then that goes into academic cooperation with practical actors. The American communication experts were like, no, 4 colors is much more simple and impactful, and one has to make compromises sometimes when doing public work. But this has been very useful for people, and I warmly recommend, if you feel like it, to experiment within various settings. Just the simple idea of putting out some emotion words, perhaps colors. The color scheme is not here very symbolical. That can be helpful. And in emotion science, there's much agreement that being able to name emotions even roughly to the right direction helps people to manage those emotions. And then there's different views of how much we should manage our emotions and in what way. This goes to the topic of emotion norms also. But generally, if you're able to recognize that whether you are feeling actually fear or anger primarily will help you to react constructively to that energy in your body-mind, would be one way to put it. And there can be complicated phenomena where there is a kind of primary emotion, let's say, for example, threat of shame, referring to Steen's example, but then for various reasons, the person doesn't want to feel that shame or that it feels too much. And then there's a secondary reaction of, let's say, anger about the threat of shame. So it goes into kind of secondary emotion. And these dynamics are much present in environmental and climate situations also. There is also an emoji version available on the Climate Mental Health Network website. Emojis would be another topic for analyzing communication. At least for me, many of these are quite telling about what I feel when I read the global news. Do we have any Norwegians around? There's a sort of Edvard Munch reference also present here. By the way, there on the right with the light green, that's a sort of unofficial climate anxiety emoji. It keeps on smiling even though it's melting. On the website, there's also several guides and tip sheets, including this short guide to climate emotions, which I wrote together with Anja Kamenets. So just to let you know that there's some practical resources there. So main themes for me today are emotions and environmental issues, connections with religion, something about coping with the ecological crisis that includes pro-environmental behavior dimensions and also the attitude dimension. So this is a very brief set list of what I'm going to talk about. By the way, is my speed of talking okay with you? With the Finnish accent? Yeah, just say if I'm not making sense at some point. Just as a very brief introduction, this is the earlier study about history of Christian environmental thought, and I used to work much more with practical religious environmentalism. Now I've been more into academia and leading workshops, sometimes to religious audiences, but most often just general secular audiences. There's also a subchapter on Charles Raven, for example, a significant figure in the history of science and religion discussions from Britain, who also had environmental leanings, but that's just to mention as an introduction. If you can't access the book but would like to read something about it, there's a sort of summarizing article, open access here. And for those of you who want to have the slides, I'm sure we can find a way to get them to you. So first about eco-emotions. Why emotions? Depending on your native language, there's a different vocabulary about emotions, even theoretically. For example, in Finnish, we only use tunne for both emotion and feeling. So in our language, we don't do a separation between emotion and feeling. Then if we need clarifications, we need to talk about what kind of emotion or feeling do we refer to, or whether we are talking about conscious emotion or more unconscious or something in between. In the English-speaking world, there's different definitions. I'm tempted to go further into that, but I'll not do that. And emotions are connected with behavior and attitudes, and also with ethics. One of the frameworks around this is moral emotions, but there's also other kinds of connections with ethics and different ideas of what a good life or good behavior is, or a honorable way of being in the world, as some might put it. Also, there's research about how whether one is able to deal with emotions constructively or not has implications for well-being and functionality. For example, if you only repress anger for years and years, it will even have physical maladaptive impacts. And it's quite complex, but that's very interesting and important research also. The relationship between emotion and cognition is complex. What I heard about the last conference was that you actually discussed this in relation to Ian McGilchrist, for example. Now, I'll make a disclaimer that I haven't used AI in the preparation of this presentation, except for this slide, which was actually quite nice summary. Emotion and cognition are fundamentally intertwined, not separate processes. cognition is needed to elicit emotional responses, and emotions in turn modulate and guide cognitive processes. This bidirectional relationship means that our feelings influence our thoughts, and our thoughts influence our feelings. So this is the half a second definition you get now, or I got when I googled the relationship between emotion and cognition. I wanted to test that, what does it say, but based on my reading, I would generally agree, but of course there's wide variety of takes on this. And that means that when we make decisions, emotions are not completely absent, and we may have different kinds of levels of consciousness about how much emotions or feelings affect our decisions. And this is an important point also in relation to science and research, where there is a long-standing tradition of trying to stay more on the cognition side than on the emotion side. And sometimes with the idea that we could just completely leave emotions aside, but that's not technically fully possible. But that's not the main theme for me here. I'll move on to describe some prominent research themes in relation to eco-emotions, raising up some points about them. I'll not go through a very long array of emotions because that would make me speak even faster. And in the Q&A, we can return to some emotions that you are especially interested about. Now, one category is what I call threat-related emotions. So emotions related to uprisals of various kinds of threats. And this includes emotion words such as fear, worry, concern, and anxiety. And this would be a topic of its own to discuss how these are related to each other. I'm quite fond myself of a kind of continuum view of seeing intensity of threat-related emotion as captured usually in language use by different concepts. For example, that worry is more milder than anxiety and fear. But then again, some of these terms, especially anxiety, are very complex and used differently by people coming from different backgrounds and different contexts. And there's been much debate about the concept of eco-anxiety, for example, that whether it's a good idea or not to use the concept of anxiety to describe the phenomenon, because for some people it may lead strongly towards images of something pathological and mental health issues. But then again, for other people, anxiety is much more wide-ranging, and in different languages there's also differences in this. For example, in Finnish we might say that something anxieties someone, ahdistaa, and we don't mean that it's heavy anxiety state or that the person is having a general anxiety disorder. We mean that something is significantly bothering somebody, and so there's an issue which needs attention, and that's quite fundamental aspect of anxiety as emotion, now using the concept of emotion a bit more strictly. I have written quite a lot about varieties of eco-anxiety. That was sort of the entry of my research into the international eco-emotion studies. This paper, Anxiety and the Ecological Crisis, an analysis of eco-anxiety and climate anxiety, is a major form of that. It's in the Sustainability Journal, which has since gone worse, I have to say, but the problems of academic publishing are another topic. And then together with emotion researcher and philosopher Charlie Kurt, a very bright fellow, we did a paper on eco-anxiety based on Kurt's biocognitive theory of anxiety. And Kurt has the view that anxiety as an emotion, which is related to a kind of affect program that goes more into nuances, is related to perceiving some kind of threat which includes some uncertainty, perhaps unpredictability, and perhaps uncontrollability. And these three are also classic elements in anxiety research, also referring to stronger anxiety states. So if there is much uncertainty, and if there is much uncontrollability, that you feel that you can't fully control the threat, it's related to what is called efficacy beliefs and locus of control in psychology. And if there is unpredictability, then anxiety levels rise. But people may have various kinds of skills to regulate the anxiety levels. So the same kind of threatening situation doesn't cause the same kind of impact in all people in all contexts and situations. So there's going to be differences. But fundamentally, what I'm saying and what we are saying is that eco-anxiety, if we use that word, some people prefer to use eco-distress, but distress is not exactly an unambiguous concept either. So it can have many forms. It can manifest as physical and psychosomatic anxiety symptoms. We know from research that some people lose sleep because they are so worried and anxious about the ecological crisis or the broader socio-ecological crisis. Nowadays, it becomes difficult to separate only the ecological crisis from the polycrisis in which we live, if we use that word. There might be various pain states, for example, in the body and those kinds of things. And in worst cases, there may be significant loss of meaning, which can then lead also to risk of suicidal ideation, which is complex then again, because often there's many factors affecting people's lives. So, but I think it's important to emphasize that it's not a light deal for people, and for some people, anxiety about the socio-ecological state of the world can be a very serious existential issue, which then goes into the category of mental health issues, even though it's not fundamentally pathological. And as you can see, when at the same time eco-anxiety has this practical anxiety dimension related to problem solving and noticing threats. So people observe that, hey, there's problems about ecology and climate change. What should I do about them? That usually leads people to search for more information and to make some kind of behavior changes. But then those behavior changes might be, from an environmental ethics point of view, constructive. Many people have ended up changing their life ways or even their life paths completely because of this awareness. And we are arguing that practical eco-anxiety is present in these kinds of trajectories and processes. And for some people, it includes a significant period of being more distressed, and for other people, it's milder. So there's the practical dimension, there may be the awful, more paralyzing dimension, which makes public communication about this tricky, and it can be used in politics in many ways. There was a thesis done in Finland about the use of the Finnish word for climate anxiety in the Finnish parliament in 2022 or 3, and guess what parties used the word most? Populist right-wing parties, because they wanted to frame it as something which is caused by liberal left and Greens and is now affecting the mental health of young people. So these are the things, if you're an eco-anxiety researcher working in the public sphere, that you have to deal with, and I'll not even go into the North American politics at the moment. Except perhaps mentioning that some people recommended I should print to my office wall the letter from Ted Cruz to a national committee arguing that there's dangerous research coming on climate emotions and climate emotions wheel and that sort of thing. But anyway, so this is empirical research. I'll not go very much into numbers, even though Fraser might have wanted me to do that, but I'm at least giving you information about where those are found. So this was actually led by two scholars from University of Bath, Caroline Hickman and Elizabeth Marks. I worked very closely in doing this. So it was a major international study of 1,000 people in 10 countries. So altogether 10,000 people aged from 16 to 25 about their emotions they have felt in relation to climate change and their attitudes towards climate politics by world governments. And the results were quite striking, and they have been replicated in various countries, showing that it's not only young people in privileged countries who are feeling climate anxiety and worry and fear, but also, and very prominently, in countries where there's more direct impacts of climate change. This is related to the Q&A earlier today. There may be very serious worry and fear. It may not always surface. There may be countries where there is so much else you have to take care of in your daily life, so many different crises, so many different injustices, that in the public sphere there is not as much talk about eco-anxiety and climate anxiety. And anyway, those concepts may not feel the best possible by people in non-Western countries, which is very understandable. And I've been trying to argue that people should be able to use concepts that they feel are suitable to their own experiences. But then we also need for research some kind of joint concepts so that researchers can find studies done by others. So that revealed very significant emotional impact of climate change and very significant disappointment at world governments. Actually so significant that Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, referred to the study in autumn 2021 in the opening speech for United Nations gathering, mentioning that, you know, over half of these young people feel that global governments have betrayed them in relation to climate politics. So there's a lot of indignation, feelings of betrayal. It goes into intergeneral dynamics, where the young people have trust that there is possibility for that. And it goes into dynamics of environmental citizenship or citizenship in general, where the young people feel that their voices are heard or respected. So it's a very important issue, I would argue. There's some recent books on more about eco-anxiety and climate anxiety. So the way I'm using these concepts is that I think that we need a broader word for any kind of anxiety or threat-related emotions about ecological issues. And then climate anxiety or distress is part of that, very significant part. But I don't think that it's a good idea to put climate-related terms as the top ones, because there might be anxiety about what happens to the old-growth forest near you, or what happens to the prairie next to you. So there's threat-related emotions resonating with local and global environmental issues, which are not completely tied with climate change. But anyway, now that I have made much harder to listen to me by showing the book covers, there's a collection of articles about climate change and youth mental health. There's also a chapter of mine about definitions of climate distress in various languages and a bit more philosophically, mentioning also some other European languages. In the middle, a more therapist-oriented book, there's actually a discussion piece between Caroline Hickman and Timothy Morton in that book, also referring to the previous presentation. Caroline, by the way, lives near Chippenham, so we had a lovely meeting on Saturday, so thanks to ISSR for making connections possible. But so that's relevant for also other people than therapists, and for example, the discussion between Hickman and Morton is quite fascinating. On the right, there's a more education-oriented book, much discussing also university education. So for those of you who do teaching, there would be relevant content there. Lots of short chapters. The main editors are coming from the States. How to teach in a burning world, the existential toolkit for climate justice educators. So lots of intersectional dimensions there also. For philosophy, there's a very recent book called The Philosophy of Environmental Emotions, Grief, Hope and Beyond, which I recommend. The hardback is a bit expensive, as they tend to be, but at least the paperback is a bit more reasonable. Is Peter Vaskovic here already? Oh, nice to meet you. So Peter knows many people who are deeply connected with this project. I wrote some closing remarks. And more on the practical dimension, there's a recent Pastoral Psychology Journal team number on climate emotions. Guest editors were Ryan Lamotte and Pamela McCarroll from North America and me. There's a paper by Danish Christine Tint Johannessen, for example. Many of the papers focus on pastoral or spiritual care, but there's also more philosophical, ethical analysis, for example, on the possible need for more moral outrage among people in privileged countries, instead of just being more mild. That's a complex thing. I did a paper on religious coping with eco-anxiety and ecological grief, which actually resonates with some themes raised up by Mike Hulme yesterday also. So religion may be used in many ways in relation to these kinds of emotions and existential questions, and I'll try to come back to that later. So that was about threat-related emotions. I try to keep it brief. I often keep presentations only about them, but now I try to be more brief, going to some other dimensions. One is related to awe, wonder, environmental values, identity, behavior. In the field of environmental education, there's a lot of papers on this. In classics on environmentalism, this is much present. And I think that there's also a strong current about this in history of science and religion discussions. If one reads books from the 20th century on science and religion and our relationship with the more than human world, the dimension of awe and wonder is very often present, at least in my reading. Then moving on to guilt and shame, or that kind of emotion family. That's a nice concept also, emotion family, related to emotions which are related, sort of the same bunch or group, while they may not be exactly similar. The central role of guilt dynamics in environmental communication has been observed, and now again, our interpretations of what is meant by the word guilt may have differences. Some people, into their mind comes examples from childhood. You broke something belonging to your parents, and then you are like, what's gonna happen? But the guilt may also manifest in much more fleeting instances of, for example, you're in the supermarket, you have some environmental values and knowledge, then you see the price difference between two products, then you end up taking the cheaper but more unethical one, and you feel short flash of guilt, but then you move on because as contemporary citizen you have learned sort of to move on about this. So that's also related to environmental guilt, if we call it that way. And a major question is that what does environmental guilt or its variations lead into, and in what kind of situations? And one of the persons who has discussed this a lot is Sarah Fredericks from University of Chicago. Celia knows her well, but I think Celia has to be somewhere else at the moment. So there's a whole book from Oxford University Press called Environmental Guilt and Shame, which is a bit technical but very, very interesting, and it deals with the ethical questions that when is it apt and reasonable to evoke environmental guilt or shame in people, and in what ways. And in psychology, there's again different views about this. And if you go into Journal of Environmental Psychology, for example, and Google ecological guilt, you'll find articles which have some empirical parts arguing that, environmental guilt leads to pro-environmental behavior intentions. It's often intentions which are studied, which is a challenge. And then you'll find papers saying that no, expectation of pride is much more motivating, that we shouldn't, evoke guilt in people, but instead sort of motivate them that it's you get feelings of pride and honor if you act in a certain way. I'm a sort of pluralist or pragmatist in this sense that I think that because people and situations are so different, we're gonna need different kinds of environmental communication. And I'm very skeptical of research which tries to find the one best eco-emotion for pro-environmental behavior. That's part of my interdisciplinary background. That, for example, some people are arguing that anger is better than anxiety. But then again, what kind of anxiety are we talking about? Some of those studies measure anxiety only by using strong anxiety scales. And then it's not surprising that if we compare a person who is very distressed to a person who is more in an agitated state, that I want to do something, that then anger is more connected to pro-environmental behavior intentions. But then if we take a longer view of how threat-related emotions are present in people's lives as they form environmental values and identities, then it's a more complex thing. Am I making sense, by the way? Excellent. So here's a test for your eyesight. No worries if you can't see it. This is just an example of something which also my students have found very, very useful. It's a socio-ecological modeling of factors which affect, in this case, children's and adolescents' climate anxiety. And this paper takes a view quite similar to what I've been taking with Kurt, is that how the threat of climate change is interpreted. That's linked with climate anxiety. So not just the distress part, but also related to the appraisal. So there's micro-level factors, meso factors, the role of family and peers is important, and emotion norms and examples in those spheres. Community, going more widely to cultural influences and more regional physical changes also. So just to say that it's very important, I think, to think about these kinds of factors and how they affect people's emotion dynamics. So if we only do studies of what do people feel and then what intentions they have for behavior, but we don't study any of this, I think there's very significant gaps left. And not all people have same kind of access to agency or neither. So that's the source for that socio-ecological modeling. Tara Grandon is doing very interesting sort of systems approach work on climate anxiety currently. Now coming towards scientists, this is a very interesting paper called Keeping the Heart Away from the Brain, the Emotional Labor of Climate Scientists by Leslie Head and Teresa Harada. So they did empirical study on how do climate scientists manage with the emotions evoked by the topic and the work that they do, and the challenges in the impact and reception of that work. So the social dynamic, which Thomas, for example, mentioned very early on, is very much present there. And then different contexts like workplace and family, they found out that many of the climate scientists very rarely talked about climate change at home. And there was a benevolent motivation of not to cause distress to your family. But then again, for family members, it might have been quite strange that, you know, there's no discussion of that at home. So there's a quote, in response to contextual drivers that include the social norms of science and a strong climate denialist influence and the preservation of self and family, these scientists mobilize a range of behaviors and strategies to manage their emotions around climate change and the future. These include emphasizing dispassion, a very classic view in Western science. This would go into sort of gendered analysis and feminist critique of elements in Western science also. Suppressing painful emotions, using humor, that's what I personally sort of like, and switching off from work. Emotional denial or suppression of the consequences of climate change worked to enable the scientists to persevere in their work. But however, the study suggests that painful emotions like anxiety, fear, and loss around climate change need to be acknowledged and discussed. So the argument was that in the long run, it would be very important to talk about these emotions, process them, engage with them, instead of just disconnecting from them, even though that may be very understandable in the short run.
5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. So guilt and shame are both explicitly and implicitly used much in environmental communication. I thought about making some points about this, but I'm sort of running out of time, even though I might be so bold to go a couple of minutes over because we discussed the emotion wheel a bit in the beginning, but let's see whether Fraser and others drag me out of here or not. For example, the tricky we in liturgies of religious environmentalism is an issue which would need critical social analysis. Is it reasonable with the old ladies in the local congregation to have environmental confessions like we have spoiled all the earth, or whether there would be a need for some more critical social analysis that what kind of forces and actors in society are actually producing most of the damage. Tim Jensen's book Ecologies of Guilt is a very insightful one in this manner. There's also mention of British Petroleum popularizing the use of individual carbon footprint calculators in an effort to transfer the discourse from social criticism towards individuals monitoring their own stuff. Hippie-hypocrite paradox is one of his insights. If you go to a climate demonstration, somebody shouts at you, are you driving a car? Are you eating an avocado? And if you then go to live on the land community and say something about environmental values, people say to you that, you know, you're not part of the contemporary society, so you shouldn't say anything about these matters. So that's the hippie-hypocrite paradox that you may be criticized for both reasons. And scapegoat dynamics are also present. Has somebody seen the movie First Reformed? Yeah, I would love to discuss that. I strongly recommend it. It's very interesting. Here's a line from it. Can God forgive us for what we've done to this world? A troubled member of the congregation asks the pastor, played by Ethan Hawke. I don't know. There's a forthcoming book where I discuss this a bit, but mostly I just want to recommend the movie. So various possible dispositions ending this guilt part. There may be environmentally aware people who struggle with constant burdens of guilt and or shame, which is at least a psychological and pastoral problem if you go into that dimension. There's people with some environmental values who manage to regulate eco-guilt by sustainable consumption, and there may be non-committed people who utilize psychosocial defenses or coping methods against the threat of guilt and shame. So with this example of the emotion family of guilt and shame, I've tried to show some of the quite complex dynamics which can be present around eco-emotions, and there's profound connections with religion in many ways. Now, to end this, just a couple of minutes about processes, and this is the final thing here. One of the main efforts in my research in the 2020s was to do a process model of eco-anxiety and grief. Up to the point, most people had been using stages of grief models by Kubler-Ross to describe something like stages of climate grief, and the words in that model are very evocative. They found resonance, but then there's also problems in beliefs that the models are linear. For example, that you can move from depression to acceptance and then you're a happy environmentalist. After that, there's much more fluctuation, and I try to describe some of that here. The key idea is that there's 3 dimensions that people need: action, grieving, including other emotional engagement, and distancing, including both self-care and avoidance. So it's a kind of psychological flexibility model influenced by, for example, the dual process model of coping with bereavement by Strobe and Schutt, for those of you who want to read about grief research, recognizing that there will be fluctuation and there will be much need for also transformation in the ethical sense. There's a website where we have videos about the model. I didn't go into the chronological parts now. This was funded by the Finnish Nesting Foundation last year. So there's a short animation, and there's a longer discussion video with this social media person, queer brown vegan Isaias Hernandez from United States. So if you want to listen more about the process model, you can find those videos on the website. Some of my recent work deals then with sort of applying this to religious communities, and this is one of the examples. Now you can't see the title, but it's engaging with climate grief, guilt, and anger in religious communities, focusing especially on Christianity and Buddhism. And perhaps that's my last point here, also referring to this empirical paper by a doctoral student of ours, Johannes Keynes, where there was interviews about Western Buddhist climate activists. It may be that religious traditions have certain emotion norms, like many branches of Christianity and Buddhism say that don't be angry. And then people who are active found out that, hey, actually, moral outrage can be a strong force in activism. Of course, we need to regulate it so that we don't just smash things on the street, but it's actually something also constructive which works against injustice. So there may be negotiation between the inherited emotion norms from religion and the complexity of how these dynamics really are. Well, the ending part was a bit of a rush, but I wanted to give you a glimpse that there is a process model and there is also empirical research about negotiation of these dynamics. Hopefully this has been insightful. Thanks a lot for the invitation and attention.